This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Israeli forces raided and closed the offices of 7 Palestinian civil society groups in the occupied West Bank Thursday. Several of the groups report soldiers confiscated items and files before leaving behind notices declaring the groups unlawful. Israel designated 6 out of the 7 groups as terrorist organizations last year, a decision met with criticism from both the United Nations and international human rights groups. Groups raided on Thursday include the human rights organization Al-Haq, the Addameer Prisoner Support and Human Rights Association, the Bisan Center for Research and Development, Defense for Children International Palestine, the Union of Agricultural Workers Committees, and the Union of Palestinian Women's Committees. Israel's crackdown on Palestinian civil society groups has been condemned across the globe. The Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights condemned Thursday's raids, stating, quote, Israel's disturbing designation of these organizations as terrorist organizations has not been accompanied by any public, concrete, and credible evidence, they said. Amnesty International also condemned Israel's actions and praised the Palestinian groups targeted. One Amnesty official said, quote, these organizations have contributed enormously to human rights in the occupied Palestinian territories and across the globe, yet Israeli army boots trample all over their work, Amnesty said. Thursday's raids came 100 days after Israeli forces shot dead Al Jazeera journalist Shireen Abu Akleh as she covered an Israeli military raid on the Jenin refugee camp. The Israeli raid also came as the United Nations has condemned Israel for killing 19 children in recent weeks in Gaza and the occupied West Bank. We're joined now by members of 2 of the Palestinian groups raided Thursday. Brad Parker's with us, Senior Advisor for Policy and Advocacy at Defense for Children International Palestine, one of the groups criminalized by Israel. He's based here in the United States. And joining us from Ramallah is Sahar Francis, General Director at Addameer Prisoner Support and Human Rights Association. Sahar Francis, let's begin with you. Describe for us what took place on Thursday.
Hello, and actually yesterday we waked up for the terrible news that the Israeli occupation forces raided Ramallah city and they entered and to the Palestinian 7 organizations, and they confiscated property and messed the files and broke furniture, and they sealed the doors of these 7 organizations in order to enforce the closure of physically closing all the 7 organizations and to implement actually what the military the military commander authorized last year, that these 7 organizations are illegal organizations and they are not supposed to continue their essential work that we continued actually to implement in the last couple of months to offer the services, the usual important service that we do for prisoners, for children, for women, for farmers, for patients, and to protect human rights in general, to document all these violations, as you described in your introduction, that takes place on daily basis on the occupied territories, and to advocate and lobby around these war crimes in order to seek accountability.
And Brad Parker, can you describe what happened to Defense for Children International Palestine?
So early morning, around 5:30 a.m. yesterday, Israeli forces, there's around 100 soldiers outside of our office. From the CCTV footage inside the office, dozens of soldiers inside, sort of rooting through desks, files, removing a photocopier, printer, computer, client files of files of the children that we represent in the Israeli military courts. As as Sahar said, they sealed our door, so physically welded shut the door with metal, and then taped a notice to the door ordering the closure of the office and essentially shutting down or attempting to shut down our activities.
Now, this follows last year, the designation of 6 Palestinian human rights groups by the Israeli government as terrorist, including both of yours, Defense for Children International and Sahar, your group, Addameer. Among those that condemned this, United Nations, foreign ministries of Belgium, Denmark, France, Germany, Ireland, Italy, the Netherlands, Spain, and Sweden. Sahar Francis, what has this meant for your organization?
Of course, this Israeli step aimed to silence us and to prevent us from, as I said, offering the services we do and the documentation of the violations. And this support of the international community, whether from the UN side or the diplomatic side, all these states that you named, it just came to confirm our respected work and the professionalism that we are implementing our work and the fact that all the secret information that Israel claimed that it's the base for their decision, this is a proof that this information wasn't sufficient and these countries were not convinced actually that this is a base for the Israeli allegation, and this is why they continued to support us and they issued their statement. So we believe that the Israeli action yesterday came as an answer for such a statement and the rejection from these states for the Israeli allegations. So in fact, actually yesterday, Israel sent a message that we are the masters, we are the ones who controls in the occupied territory and decides who could continue or not in the reality on the ground.
In July, Democratic Congressmember Ayanna Pressley of Massachusetts and 21 other Congress members sent a letter to the Biden administration demanding public rejection of the Israeli delegation of Palestinian human rights groups as terrorist groups by Israeli authorities. The lawmakers wrote in part, quote, "A reported lack of evidence to support this decision raises concerns that it may be a deeply repressive measure designed to criminalize and silence prominent and essential Palestinian human rights organizations. The U.S. must always and consistently speak out against efforts by all countries attempting to undermine civil society and the necessary work of humanitarian organizations," unquote. Brad Parker, has there been any response from the Biden administration?
Not as of yet. And I think the Biden administration has been pretty silent on the designations and the attempts to criminalize Palestinian civil society over the past 10 months. The usual sort of rhetoric is that they're reviewing the information that the Israeli authorities have provided, but they haven't sort of taken a position one way or the other. That was maybe new, with some nuance, adjusted slightly yesterday, saying that the State Department spokesperson noted that the information so far doesn't suggest that the U.S. would change their position, even though that position has never been articulated in an express way. So maybe that's an opening. But I think it's also important that, over the past 10 months, the conduct by Israeli authorities to criminalize us and criminalize our work is really part of a years-long campaign to delegitimize and essentially criminalize the work that we do to expose grave violations against Palestinians at the hands of Israeli forces, and the work that we do to hold Israeli officials accountable, whether it's at the International Criminal Court or the lobbying work that we do globally with various governments. So I think the letter from Representative Pressley and, combined with the various European governments, United Nations officials coming out consistently to condemn these repressive tactics by the Israeli government to criminalize our work says everything that people should know, that we are researchers, we are social workers, we are lawyers, working to highlight the human impact of Israeli policies and Israeli oppression on Palestinians living in occupied Palestinian territory.
Earlier this week, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, the former Chilean president, expressed alarm over the number of Palestinian children killed recently by Israel. Over the past 10 days, Israeli forces have killed 19 Palestinian children, 17 in Gaza and 2 in the occupied West Bank. In a statement, President Bachelet said, quote, "Inflicting hurt on any child during the course of conflict is deeply disturbing. The killing and maiming of so many children this year is unconscionable," she said. Now, earlier this week, the Israeli newspaper Haaretz reported that an internal Israeli military report has acknowledged that an Israeli airstrike near the Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza killed 5 Palestinian children August 7th. The youngest child was 4 years old. During Israel's recent assault on Gaza, Israeli officials repeatedly denied killing Palestinian children. This is Karen Hajoff, the international spokesperson for the Israeli Prime Minister Yair Lapid, speaking August 6th.
Tonight, Islamic Jihad terrorists fired a rocket towards Israel, which fell short inside Gaza, hitting a Palestinian home in the Jabalia neighborhood and tragically killing at least 4 children. There is video documenting the entire thing. There was no Israeli activity in the Gaza Strip, in that area, or at that time. Islamic Jihad is killing Palestinian children in Gaza.
Brad Parker, you are with Defense for Children International. Your response?
So what we've seen over the past 10 years or more is that Israeli forces routinely carry out attacks in densely populated civilian and residential areas where children bear the brunt of those attacks. Over the past year so far, in 2022, we've documented 20 Palestinian children shot dead by Israeli forces in the occupied West Bank. We documented 17 Palestinian kids killed during the latest round of Israeli military offensive in Gaza. We continue to investigate a number of those cases, but the case referenced here in the cemetery in Jabalia is attributed to Israeli forces. And it really is a pattern that we see consistently going back, as I said, more than 10 years, where Israeli forces attack and use explosive weapons, targeted strikes, drone strikes, where there's complete disregard for international humanitarian law and the rules of war for who can be targeted. And we constantly are documenting cases of Israeli forces killing Palestinian children, whether excessive use of force, disproportionate use of force, or intentionally targeting civilians, including children, that amount to war crimes and just complete disregard for international law.
Sahar Francis, you're General Director at Addameer Prisoner Support and Human Rights Association. You recently were denied boarding in Israel for a flight that was transiting through the United States to a meeting you were trying to attend in Mexico. Do you have any information about why you were barred? Are you on some kind of blacklist?
Actually, this was very shocking at that time when I was banned boarding to the airplane without even explaining to me in real time why I was not allowed, while I had a valid visa to the United States till April 23. And then I tried to figure why I was banned, actually. And several months after, just in June, I get a response that my visa was canceled. again, without explaining actually why my visa was cancelled. And I think it's totally related to the fact that what we are facing as an organization, the allegations from the Israeli side, and actually the silence of the U.S. on the official position against this designation of the organizations could be one of the reasons for such practices against the individuals, against myself, against other colleagues, that they would be banned travel outside of the occupied territories, or other harassment and threats and intimidations that we can face as human rights defenders because of this Israeli attack against the organizations.
Earlier this month, the European Union, with a majority vote, decided to unfreeze up to $215 million in funds for the 6 Palestinian groups like Addameer that had been designated by Israel as terrorists, though so many countries and the United Nations have condemned this designation. Do you know what's happening with this money?
Actually, Addameer specifically, we're not getting direct fund from this fund, but I would believe that the Commission with the local office of the EU would be responsible for maintaining and continuing the projects that some of the 6 organizations were involved on, because it's really, there's no basis, no clear evidences against the organizations that can justify what was the freezing the projects that were implemented, and it was much politicized from the side of the EU at the first point to suspend the projects with these organizations.
Finally, your organization is currently working to stop administrative detention, which enables the Israeli government to detain anyone based on secret information. How many people are held in this condition? And will the fact that the Israeli military raided your offices where you have your legal cases, does that compromise the work you can do?
Definitely, it will compromise the kind of legal services that we can offer for the administrative detainees and for the other Palestinian political prisoners we are representing in front of the military courts, the Israeli military courts. Currently, there's around 700 administrative detainees. Some of them, they are children. Some, they are sick people that they need urgent health treatment while in administrative detention. And at least one person, Khalil Awaudi, he's in more than 150 days of a hunger strike under immediate threat to his life, where Addameer were in the last couple of days, with the support of the other colleagues from the human rights organizations, issuing urgent appeal to release him and trying to lobby on his behalf to be released under these circumstances.